If I have an argument with a local, I do get the go back to your country thing from time to time, but very, very rare, and it's mostly my fault.
Meet Dennis. He's from the US and has been living in Singapore for 17 years and he still doesn't hold a PR. We had a really exciting conversation about prejudices against expats and why he won't retire in the city. By the way, I'm Max, an entrepreneur and YouTuber from Singapore. Let's go!
How's your perspective changed through these years about Singapore?
I think anywhere you live is somewhat dependent on the phase of life you're in. So as an example, if I had first moved to Asia when I was in my 20s and didn't have kids or wasn't married, then Hong Kong would be an absolutely fantastic place to live. But with kids and married, I think Hong Kong would be a dreadful place to live. In that way, like I had my raising my kids period in Singapore where the things that I loved were being able to give them the overseas experience, being able to have them educated in absolutely maybe one of the best schools on the face of the earth. My kids, we lived close to orchards, so they'd see people in saris and they'd see people in hijab and they'd hear 20 different languages, and they never their whole lives growing up ever asked, why is that person different, or what is that? They just assimilated that experience. So that for me was a big reward. Once when my ex and I split up, and as the kids were growing, my relationship to the place changed from going to baseball games and basketball games to establishing a friend group. I was traveling quite a lot more with work. I became, in a way, more conscious of the safety of the place because I can be by myself on this island at any time of night or day and feel 100% completely safe, which is helpful.
You mentioned this diversity of like different people, different backgrounds, like religions in Singapore. Speaking about like big cities in the US, I think it's quite similar, no? If you go to New York City or San Francisco.
US cities can be diverse, but they're also very neighborhood specific. Most of my family lives in Los Angeles, and LA is, of course, as in total very diverse, but it's like a quilt, and the patches on the quilt, this is the Korean patch, and this is the Chinese patch, and this is the Vietnamese patch, and this is the Mexican patch. It isn't as diverse within neighborhoods. It's diverse across the city, but there are, I think, more or less defined parts of town that are specific to a place. The thing about Singapore's diversity is that they've been very, I think, deliberate and very targeted in saying that we don't want, this to be the Chinese part of town, and this to be the Malay part of town, and this to be the Indian part of town. And there's a little bit of that, but like in an HDB development, you have to have a mix of ethnicities in the building. So it feels slightly different. We still have Chinatown and Little India and the Malay Quarter, but those are more symbolic and historical. The other thing I would say is when I moved to Singapore this time, I was living in Boise, Idaho, which is substantially less diverse than some of the cities you mentioned. I worked at HP, so it was more diverse in my work environment, but in the city itself, it was like probably close to 95% white.
Based on that you in Singapore for so many years, you probably like the place.
I love it.
But if you don't have PR and then you want to retire at some point, or you want to just quit your job, or like just to be chill for some time, it's quite hard.
Yes, but not as hard as retiring and living in Singapore would be. This is not the sort of place that you want to live without income. I won't retire in Singapore, but for my working life, I anticipate staying here as long as I can.
What's your main principles about money in general?
My first recommendation is don't get divorced. It's extremely expensive. I send the amount that I save every month back to the US, and where I have my 401k, which is a tax-exempt retirement account that is invested in the market. So most of it, and it's a conservative way to go, but if I'm sending a steady amount back every month that I'm not touching, then that's primarily it.
You said you send money to the US. Like technically, how you do it? What
I just wire it. Just on my phone from DBS to my bank in the US, and then from my bank in the US it goes directly into the deposit account.
How long does it take?
3 days, maybe.
And what's the commission?
I don't think there's a stated commission. I think you get a slightly worse exchange rate.
In my experience, bank transfers are slow and the fees can be quite steep and unclear. I'm based in Singapore, but my family, friends and my team are all over the world. And let's be real, sometimes you need to send money ASAP, like it's an emergency. And you can do it using Instagram, the sponsor of this video. Instagram is a payments platform that lets you send and receive money from all around the world. It's super easy to use and totally totally secure. Because this service is overseen by 9 financial regulators worldwide, you can be sure that they do everything by the book. The good news is that they have a headquarters in Singapore, and you know, in Singapore everyone likes to follow the rules, right? Instagram is transparent about the fees, unlike the traditional methods. You'll receive a full breakdown of every cent you transfer, and they have real-time fraud prevention measures to keep your money safe. Apart from emergencies, fast money transfers have many other uses. For example, expats may need to send regular support to their family, while freelancers could require speedy and secure payments from overseas clients. To do that, simply sign up for an account on their website or mobile app, verify your identity, and start sending money. If you are thinking about transferring money overseas, Instagram is definitely worth checking out. Just click the link in the description below to get started and make your transfer with ease. And now let's go back to the video.
Do you remember any cultural shocks at the time?
As an example, now we have Grab and you know, you can get a taxi on the apps, and at that time you would have to call up and book a cab, and you could be on hold for 20 minutes waiting and then tell them where you were. And we made friends with an expat couple. They were in a taxi queue at City Hall at Raffles City. Taxis kept coming up, and while they were at the head of the queue, and people would jump in and get in, and the guy like starting to lose his temper. He's like, what is happening? And finally he like smacked the back of one of the taxis, and he's like, we have been waiting here. And of course all of those people had called, so he didn't know that that was a thing. It's a little bit of a shock to get a helper when you come from, as an American. I know other Western countries it's quite normal to have people that work in the home, but in the US it's extremely unusual. So that took some getting used to. At the time we also had a car, so there was some of the cultural driving culture is different. And not just driving on the left-hand side of the street, but let's just say if you live in Singapore, the amount of money you spend on your car is pretty highly correlated to how impolite you might be behind the wheel. So I would have my frustrations with that from time to time. But when I came here working for HP, while there were definitely local differences between HP US and HP Singapore, by and large, the company culture was quite similar regardless. Little differences, like as an example, I worked in Boise, Idaho, so it was quite extreme. Like if you wanted to leave early, you would just go, I'm leaving early, I'll make it up for you and make it up tomorrow. Here, a very pronounced deference to people who are senior to you in an organization. So when my ex and I lived here the first time, she had a boss who would stay working until 10 p.m. and the people who worked in his team, nobody would leave until he left. So they basically, for no reason other than they didn't want to upset the boss, people stayed an additional 4 to 5 hours every day out of deference. That would not happen in the US.
Are there any habits that you adopted living in Singapore for so many years?
I guess I don't spit on the sidewalk very much. Recently, you know what chope means, but people watching might not. It's reserving a table by putting something on the table so that while you go get food, somebody doesn't steal the seat that's open. I was at a place in Chinatown near my office, and we had choped a table, and a tourist family that had just gotten their food in front of us came and just took over the table. I wasn't very proud of my reaction. I adjusted and we found another table, but my immediate reaction was like, I got a little flash of anger about it. Another thing that you're meant to do here is stand on the left side of an escalator and walk on the right side. And it makes me insane when people don't do that.
Can you recall any crazy or funny stories that happened with you in Singapore?
Pre-COVID, a friend of mine does a pub trivia quiz, and he basically started a company and does a quiz at different bars all over the island. So Monday is at Molly's and Tuesday is at Penny's and whatever. There used to be a place where we did it in Little India, and if you've ever been to Little India, you know that streets are very narrow. There are always pedestrians in the street, so people drive very slowly. So I was walking to the pub to meet my friends to do the quiz, and I stepped off a curb, and this van whipped right in front of me to the point where it knocked me backward, and I took my hand and smacked the back of the van. So all of a sudden, the guy slams on the brakes, comes flying out of the car, screaming, cussing at me, and I cuss back at him, and so we're going at it a little bit. And then I was like, you know what, not worth it. So I walked off and I went into the pub. 20 minutes later, I see the driver looking in the window of the pub like this, and I'm like, oh, here we go. And then he comes in and he's talking to the bartenders, and he's doing stuff on his phone and talking to the bartenders, doing stuff on his phone. Then he sits at a table like 3 tables away. He comes and sits at a table right next to our table, and he's just staring me down. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. So the quiz starts. We do the first round. All of a sudden, the police come into the bar.
Ooh.
And they say to me, well, we're going to have to ask you to stand outside. We're going to have some questions for you. And they said, the gentleman says that you hit his car with a beer bottle and then you kicked it with your feet. And I went, I'm wearing these on my feet. I didn't kick a car. I didn't have a beer bottle. I smacked it with my open hand. Well, the driver says that you damaged his vehicle. Would you be willing to pay for the damage? I was like, absolutely effing not. It was, the officers that respond are like the conscripted ones, the national service kids, so they don't know what they're doing really. They're just the first point of contact. So they have to call in a senior officer who has to come. And this is the interesting part. So the driver of the van is giving his story, and he's giving them video of how his van has been damaged. So he's trying to blame past damage on me, which apparently I did with my open hand and my bare foot. When the senior officer comes, so you think of Singapore as like this technologically advanced, super hyper-efficient place. The senior officer comes and she pulls out a pad of paper. She takes out a pad of paper and she would ask a question. She'd say, can you tell me what happened? And then she would write, can you tell me what happened, by hand. Mm-hmm. And then I would answer the question, and then she would by hand write out my answer to the question. To me, this is unbelievable. Like, you're here. And everything was written by hand, and then they had to go back to the station and transcribe everything. They took all of my details, and you know, I'm living here by the generosity of the Singaporean government allowing me to work here. So I'm thinking in my head, oh, I'm gonna get kicked out of the country, they're gonna take my pass, whatever. So I'm kind of freaking out, and then of course, I just never hear anything about it ever again. So I try to be a little bit more measured in my response to getting almost run over, but sometimes I get a little annoyed as well.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this interview so far, just press the like button and subscribe to this channel. I have a lot of topics about life in Singapore and Malaysia. Enjoy! Did you feel any prejudice against you from locals, or it was quite easy and smooth for you to integrate in the society from the beginning?
I feel like Angmo are given, it's like white privilege in the United States, silly things. Like when I had a car, if I was driving to a friend's condo and you have to stop at the guard gate, they see a Caucasian family and they just let you in and they don't worry about it. Whereas you get a little bit harder time, I think, if you're local and they don't recognize you. I have gotten from time to time, if I have an argument with a local, I do get the go back to your country thing from time to time, but it's very, very rare and it's mostly my fault.
What's the most similar city in the US, the most similar to Singapore?
San Francisco, maybe? If you widen it to North America, I would say it's most like, there are 4 cities, San Francisco and Vancouver, which are quite similar, and Toronto and Chicago, which are quite similar in some ways. The difference now is, in California, the homelessness problem is ridiculous. So that's something that we don't deal with here in Singapore at all. It just in terms of San Francisco, because if you're in the city itself, it's the same kind of density and it's the same kind of, affluent people up against people who can barely afford to live where they live. And so in that way, it's somewhat similar. They've got waterfront, we've got waterfront. I would say the energy is quite different between Singapore and North American cities generally.
Can you specify?
Singapore is like a really interesting mix of like a go, go, go attitude around work and people's ambition and achieving success, but much more quiet in terms of outside of work and school. I think people's lives here tend to be a little more home focused. People come to Singapore who haven't been here and all the time say, I hear it's very boring in Singapore. And I pretty strongly disagree with that, because exciting is what you make out of what you're doing. And I think there's plenty to do here. And you can always find pretty much anything, apart from, drugs.
For the drugs, you can go a bit up north.
That's right.
Take a flight.
Yes, you can. It's there. You don't have to go very far. I know that Singapore has the reputation for it's not really a nightlife city by and large, but I think Singapore is as fun as anywhere.
No, I agree. I think you can find a lot of fun in Singapore.
Yeah.
And if you want more fun, you're free to go.
You're right.
Yeah.
Then you're $200 round trip away.
Exactly. Yeah. What do you think the US can adopt from Singapore Like, what would you love to have it in the US?
I think it's harder to be an American living overseas now than maybe it ever, certainly during my lifetime. There are times when you're very proud to be from where you're from, and there are times when you're less proud. The last several years, I've been on the very severe end of the less proud side of the spectrum. One of the things that I admire about Asian culture broadly, not just Singaporean culture, is that people are very focused on what's best for the community, not just what's best for the individual in all circumstances. Things like during COVID, we didn't have massive protests against wearing masks. People understood that it was the right thing to do, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you, to take that precaution when there was so much uncertainty. I think that's an envy. I mean, they're very real East and West cultural differences, and so I can't say, well, we should just adopt that. It's never going to happen. But I think there are aspects of caring about your community above yourself that are enviable and admirable.
People are saying about Singapore, oh, it's not democracy, la la. What do you think about that? You're okay that it's not like a freedom of speech like in the Western countries?
Whenever I see something in the news in the US about Singapore, they always talk about it being an autocracy and constraints on freedoms and things like that. Very honestly, if you just live your life as a normal person in Singapore, I would guess less than 2% of people living in Singapore ever feel constrained by those things at all. The laws or the fines that they have in place that everybody makes fun of, chewing gum and jaywalking and spitting or whatever, those things are in place for a very good reason, because if you go to the rest of Asia, China, mainland China in particular, all of those things are happening all the time. So I honestly think if you're a good person living your life, that I never feel constrained. I'm not going to go screaming about the police at a police station, but you almost never see police here. So like there's no negative interaction, really. It's not like, certainly in my home country, where you have cars patrolling the streets all the time. I live across from a hospital now, so I hear sirens, but I used to live up north in Bukit Panjang, and I probably in 8 years living there probably heard a siren like 4 times. Now I hear it more often. The hospital doesn't help.
I don't think that Singapore is as strict as it's positioned.
If you call it an autocracy, is that technically true? Kind of. I mean, it is, for all intents and purposes, a one-party rule system. But that one party has built this, and they've done it in a way that has, I think, demonstrated extreme competence, extreme foresight, and extreme recognition of the importance of having a fair society for everyone. And that doesn't mean income equality or redistribution of wealth or any of those things. There are very, very rich people here, and there are very, very poor people here. But it means that they've created conditions whereby virtually anyone can coexist on this island and not feel what's perceived in the West about the restrictions here.
And I think they have a pretty decent system of people communicating what they want to the government.
Right.
Regarding everything, infrastructure, you tell me. So there is a system actually.
Right.
So it's just a different system compared to, I don't know, let's say Western world. People don't go to the streets to protest. They just have the app and they say, okay, this road needs to be
It's clearly it's much easier to govern an island this size than it is to govern, a large country. But there's always a sense that the government has a very good feel for public sentiment at any given point in time. So as an example, the one that, of course, I would feel and you would feel is that when locals start to feel like there are too many foreigners and they're taking jobs away from Singaporeans, then you see the government respond with, tightening up the number of work visas they allow, or being much stricter on giving permanent residency, those types of things. In that way, I think they're pretty responsive, and they're not outwardly so. They don't say, we're doing this because we hear you. But you can feel them kind of taking the temperature and understanding where people's heads are, and sort of trying to alleviate some of those concerns through policy.
What's the main principle, not about money, but in general in life, something that you learned through the years?
For me, it's try something new every day. The world is too big and too beautiful a place not to just stick to your routine and not lift your eyes up. I mean, I literally live 100 meters from where we're taping this right now, and I've never been to this side of the park on the mountain where we're having the discussion. And that makes me a little bit sad because it's right here. Why wouldn't I know about this? But like, even when I walk down the river and around the marina, I have to remind myself to look up and actually appreciate and take in how incredibly amazing that this city and that part of the city are. I feel like sometimes you just, you're looking at your phone or you're listening to a podcast or music and you forget to like actually take it all in. So I actively appreciate where you are and what you have and try something new every day.
It was so good to have you with me, guys. If you enjoyed this video, watch one of these other interviews with Americans living in Singapore. They will disappear in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.